Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Fanalysis, the Kingkiller Chronicles. I'm Callan, this is Matt.
Hello.
And today we're going to be going over the kind of intro video for how we're going to be covering the Kingkiller Chronicles, the book series as a whole.
Thus far.
Yeah, thus far, yeah. Very much thus far. We'll get into that later.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's open up with a quick little intro of what the Kingkiller Chronicles is. To those who don't know, I'm sure there are many fantasy fans watching out there that obviously do know already. But for anyone who happens to have not found that particular kernel yet, why don't you give a brief intro, Matt?
Yeah, sure. So, we haven't uploaded in a million years, but we used to discuss kind of, very isolated pockets, and we're trying to branch out to other topics of fantasy and sci-fi. And the Kingkiller Chronicles is a series that's been there's there's two full novels, and then there's like a couple of ancillary short stories or novellas that he's written that deal in this world, and it's by the author Patrick Rothfuss. And to be honest, I didn't know a thing about it until you brought it up. I read it because of you. But the first book came out 2007. Second book came out 2011, I think, right? Because we're 10 years on from that. You basically forced me to read this so that you'd have somebody to talk to, which is not a unique story.
I needed someone. And yeah, it's not unique to that. We've both done that for various things, haven't we?
Yeah, but also specifically with this book, I've seen in forum posts people have spoken about how they've done that to their friends and how they needed somebody to talk to about. So I've seen people say that they've bought multiple copies of it so they can loan it out like a moving library to get people to read it. And it's full of like different kinds of magic and a very unique writing style. And I think I heard somewhere that he, in terms of sales, he like matched one year, he either matched or surpassed the combined works of Brandon Sanderson, who's written a million things, and he's written two. So it's definitely like, it's kind of taking the world by storm. Unfortunately, it now has the George R.R. Martin effect.
Yes,
very much. When is the next
nearly
book
identical
coming?
as well. I believe it's the same amount of years, pretty much, isn't it? In terms of the
it's
length
10
between the
years.
last books. Yeah, it's crazy.
Can you believe, like, not to get on a tangent, but the last A Song of Ice and Fire series, came out like the year that Game of Thrones, the show, debuted, and he hasn't like written a thing since then, or the year before, whatever roughly. Anyway, so hopefully these series will be finished. I really hope that they will, because I've invested a lot of like almost 2,000 pages worth of reading between these first two things, and as we'll discuss, there's so many questions and open doors or closed doors maybe that need to be explored, but basically you found this first, so I'd like you to explain how that happened, because I read it because of you, like I said. So how'd you get into it? I know you're more of a fantasy fan than me anyway.
Yes, yeah. I've not read a massive amount of fantasy books in over the years. I've kind of relatively isolated, considering how many people in the genre kind of have been so prolific with it. But for Name of the Wind, and that's part of the reason it took me so long to read the first book, Name of the Wind. It must have been like 6 years. I think I was vaguely aware of it and knew that it was something that was one, definitely on my reading list. But I kept backburning it, and I regret that now, because about 2 years, I think it was about 2 years I got you into it, right? Ago now.
It's been well, we went to Japan a year and a half ish ago with Antoine.
Yeah, so it would have been about that then. Roughly 2 years ago. Yeah, I got into it, and I think I got you into it a few months after that. And yeah, I never looked back really. I've reread it now.
3 years. Sorry.
No, it's all right. It's around that period, 2 or 3, roughly then. Yeah, and I've reread it since. I've reread different sections since, because there are some parts that are obviously more enjoyable for me than others. It's one of those ones where it went from being this back burner project that I knew I'd get to eventually, and then ended up being this thing I'm going to reread every year, at least to a certain extent, because it's easily one of my favorite fantasy novels of all time, despite numerous flaws that we're going to get into. It really does rank that highly for me, and I'm excited to kind of talk more in depth about it throughout these next series of videos.
I think at one point, when you were telling me how much I had to read these, I think the hype was such that you actually referred to him as your favorite author. Is that still the case, or
not favorite author overall? Definitely up in the like top 5
within the genre
for the fantasy genre. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. He's my favorite author in terms of prose, which we'll get to in a minute. But yeah, that's where he kind of peaks for me in terms of what he's provided to the kind of literary works of the world.
Now, we're going to get into this is really just like an overview video, like we've mentioned, and this is going to be a multi-video discussion where we go into specific topics or the specific books in more detail. This is kind of just like I feel like most people who are going to see this are already going to be familiar with the material, but on the off chance that you're not familiar with, this is just kind of a little bit of a primer. But I did want to say before we go any further that you mentioned you've been through it a few times already.
Yes, yeah, 2 times overall for both books, and then a few. I couldn't even work out how many smatterings of like specific scenes or chapters, etc.
Okay.
That I found particularly interesting and engaging, which we'll cover again later on in which ones those were.
You really pushed the idea of the audiobook, and I thought we
Yes.
should talk about that first because there's more than one audiobook out there. That's not uncommon, but it didn't really occur to me to check with you about the fact that you were reading or listening to the UK edition, which is a completely different box of chocolate, like altogether. Like the first one, or the first time I read this, rather, the first attempt, I was reading the American version, which, you know, I don't want to crap on it too much because I know it's beloved. People love it. I mean, on Audible, there's something like 87,000 user reviews, I think, of like just
It's a very
that,
popular
you know?
version, yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is because they see like this sort of hand in glove working relationship between that narrator and the author Rothfuss, because the narrator is called Nick Podell, and he apparently worked with him on the specific name pronunciations, like the canon name pronunciations. For my purposes, I don't really, and I know for years as well, I don't really care about that. so if I happen to, for multiple reasons, number one, it's just kind of my personality that I don't care about that kind of stuff too much anyway. But the version that you recommended to me, I really fell in love with that guy's style of narration, and it fits the tone so much better.
Rupert Degas brings like such a performance to the role. I mean, I to the point where I literally contacted you with my recommendation for the book, saying it's one of those rare few where I strongly recommend the audiobook over reading it because of how the story's told, and we'll get to that in a minute in detail. But he, as a narrator, genuinely was one of my favorite book narrators of all time. Just instantly, he held me. He has the breadth of character, voices, and even voices within voices for the characters when they're doing interpretations of other characters, etc. It's just phenomenal. And I remember mentioning that and trying to sell you on that, and then you went straight to the American version and were like, "What was Callan talking about?
Yeah,
this isn't that great? Has he lost his mind?"
The key issue for me, and again, we'll get into this really in specific detail when we talk about the book, but the character of the main character, Quoth, he's this sort of broken down, not necessarily defeated, but certainly like a shell of his former self. And Nick Podell's narration of the character, he doesn't sound distinctly different from any other male character to me, and he certainly doesn't have this sort of not just like morose, but this sort of the somber, almost like autumnal sort of feel, you know, which is even actually part of the way the book is described. It is autumn, actually, you know, and they make a big deal of that being like an important time for, you know, the end of things that you don't want to come creeping back. There's just a resonance and a depth to the way that Rupert Degas, Degas, right? That's his last name, Rupert Degas, whatever. There's just that quality to the way that he's doing this, and there's such a rich and a richness to his natural voice, but the variety of not just accents, but just distinct like tonality to the different voices and cadences that he gives to people and all the different characters, it really makes it flow in a way that the other one just didn't. I quit the other one. I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. I can't get into the story.
Yeah, and then I didn't even know there were two versions, but you then found that was why that was the case, and you managed to get a hold of the UK copy and listen to that. And yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it as much as I did, because everything you've said is bang on. He has a variety, but not for variety's sake, with voices that really fits and aligns with each character, and to the point where it's like that perfect casting situation. Obviously, it's all one person doing different voices, but he's chosen the right voice for every character to me, to the point where I cannot now visualize or, auditorily imagine
I know what you mean.
any
You can't hear anybody else.
alternative.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I can't hear anybody else in the role. It just does not work for me. So, and particularly with certain characters that we'll get into later, like that really kind of stood out as even though they don't really have that much relevance to the story or that much significance in the overall narrative, they're just now classic favorites for me. And yeah, it's and that's largely down to him. And again, moving into kind of the framing of the story and how it's done, it is very much a story being told. It's a kind of a group of people around the fire listening to an extraordinary storyteller tell their life's tale, basically. And that lends itself so much more to an audiobook format for me rather than reading it, not only because it fits the style, it's what would be happening if you were present in the scene, more so than any other kind of narrative and how it's described, but also the nature of the way the book is written, the power of Rothfuss's prose, it really lends itself to that. I don't know, it's like many people in different reviews refer to it as kind of lyrical. It's very musical, written word, and that listened to is just more powerful to me than read, at least as a result of the framing mechanic, the fact that there's a story being told. It really was an experience for me.
I will say I don't disagree with you at all, and I'm not arguing with that point or disputing it. I do think that there is merit to reading it because, like physically, I mean, or with an ebook, in addition to listening to it.
Absolutely, yeah. As a secondary for me, I'd go back and read it many times as well. But just for that first experience, I want to make that clear.
Yeah, and the specific reason why I have for saying that is because this author is not necessarily more so than anyone I've ever read, but certainly as much as anyone I've ever read, and as much as anyone in this genre. He's so careful about the language he uses, and there's so many things that are intentional, and there's so many tiny clues hidden, not just within the prose, but within the language, and included in that is the language he's invented, as so many fantasy authors do. There are certain terms or names or whatever that he comes up with that don't exist in our world, and you can see that there are clues and keys that he's leading into there. And so when you can visualize what he's saying, that sometimes things are more apparent than they would be if you were just listening. And sometimes, in certain terms, are necessarily they're not necessarily easily distinguished between this is a real word or this is a fantasy one. It kind of helps to be able to read and hear it. But so I also I'll mention this again later on in our more in-depth discussion, but this is one of the few works I've been through recently where I think it actually does get better upon a second reading, and also after reading the next book in the series and going back to it. I think that's often used as an excuse to defend bad stories.
I think that largely in this book's case comes from expectation. The way this novel or these two novels are written, they're bucking a lot of the kind of conventional trends that you get, particularly in the fantasy genre. If you come in here expecting a certain pacing, expecting a certain level of quote unquote relevance with the content in terms of the story being told by the character, you're going to be not necessarily disappointed, but at the very least confused, because it's the way it's kind of telling the story, and it makes clear it is very much intentional. It's not whether or not it's a misstep by the author in design. That's up to reader's discretion, but it's very much intentional as to why he's taken this choice, even if it's something you disagree with. He's done it deliberately because he's trying to tell the tale of this hero. This character. It's questionable whether or not he's even qualifies for the title of hero, but this protagonist, his story is specifically being told in the real terms. So he wants to get the accurate story. He wants to get what actually happens. At least by his own admission, trim the kind of flowers and unnecessarily
it's
over the top story that gets
sort of
played up in so many fantasies.
It's
the truth behind
among
the tale.
other things. Yeah, among other things, is a deconstruction, and that's part of what is very unusual, if not unique, about it. So it's this. I know he's described it as sort of like a backdoor view of like the hero's story. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's very much what it is. And there are times when there is that question of, well, how true is the version he's telling, and that is consciously touched upon in the text as well, and we'll get into that in more depth at some point. If indeed we can trust everything that Kvothe is saying, even in the current timeline, which is also touched upon.
Very questionable.
There's Yeah, there's many mentions of not just uh it's not just a question of like the trope or author's device or writing tool of the unreliable narration or narrator. It's consciously brought up within the text. How do you tell a good story? And there's truth isn't always the best story. There's also this question of how sincere do you sound, where there's not enough embellishment to sound sincere, or too much truth can sound insincere. Like there's sort of these clues all throughout, and there's just such a mysterious vibe to the character where even after reading almost 2,000 pages, we don't really know. We have like a fraction of his story, so there's all kinds of questions there, but ostensibly it is him breaking down his life, and like that is the format. And so you have this story within the story, because there, and that's really what I'm interested in, is the current storyline between what's going on at the Waystone Inn. I'd love to see more of that world, but I'm having to be much more patient than I'd like to be, because as we're going through his life story in long form, from the time when he's a child and onward. But we don't want to go too far in depth with this one, so I thought we would make a mention of just like the sort of the highlights of this. We've touched on the prose, I think, a little bit already. I thought we should bring up the world building a little bit. Even though we don't want to get too far in depth with that because we don't have too much time, but we should bring it up for people who aren't familiar. Would you like to kick that off?
Yeah, it's one of those ones where it's a powerful aspect of the story, or the quality of the novel, both of them. It's not mechanical, which is important for world building, because so many, particularly in the fantasy genre, so many books, when they're dealing with different elements of world building, they'll dive too deeply into the political, economic, military, whatever happens to be, mechanics of how the world runs, and that's almost entirely absent in this book, to the point where some people who are kind of more world-building inclined would say it was relatively sparse, I think. But where you get a lot of depth in that area for this is in the way the characters, and particularly the main character, Kvothe, interacts with the world around him. So the money, particularly the money he's using, as we'll get to later.
Yeah.
The people who he's dealing with in terms of the Aeolian, his musical endeavors, the university in particular, how that's set up, and the kind of strands of connections between the two kind. It's kind of pocket based. So you'll have a pocket of territory here, a pocket of territory there. So this is where this part of the story is taking place. This is where that part of the story is taking place. Very, very richly developed and very beautifully kind of gotten across to the reader as to what you should care about in that area and how it affects elsewhere in the world. But it never at any points, or very, very rarely, kind of sits and delves into the present day kind of running of the world. There's a lot of history asides going through, but that's always how it connects to the main plot or the characters' connection to it in the modern day. It's not like this general, and society works like this, and the kingdoms interact like this, and this leader does this. So it's very sparse on that level, which to me, I as someone who personally enjoys world building, it was interesting to me that didn't bother me at all, because it was one of those things where it always left me wanting more. But I'd rather that than it take the overly expository, route and just give me a bunch of information I do not need, because it really doesn't affect growth. Apart from anything else, he's self-absorbed enough to the point where if it doesn't directly, concern him and his personal journey, it's deliberately noted in the book as being cut out. This doesn't interest me. This isn't relevant. He'll skip over entire things that he doesn't value in, as part of his own story. So it fits the kind of the narrative framing as to why we're not getting these deep waffling paragraphs and pages of lore on how this kingdom works and how it connects to this kingdom and all that jazz.
Yeah, for me, who I consider myself not like I'm not a fantasy fan, but I'm less inclined toward it than you are, or at the very least, only certain types of it appeal to me. And I'm there's a significant amount of overlap between our tastes, but there's certain things you're invested in that I know nothing about, I mean to say. And world building is definitely not at the top of my list of priorities. I mean, I'll take a good world, but like to me, this is when I think about this being in any way, shape, or form seen as like sparse. I would never describe it as that, but I'm looking at it from a different perspective. Like to me, there's more than enough going on here, and it is, like you said, character based instead. But we'll touch on all this later. There's like I think he's got what, like 6 or 7 distinct confirmed magic forms already developed, and he's made mention that he
Yes.
has more, like, in the wings, like waiting in the wings, sort of like if we ever get to the third book, or like maybe we'll see some of that. And I don't think we're running kind of short on time for what we want for this particular intro video, but we'll discuss all of that stuff like in the next or in the videos to come, where we really dive into like the lore here. But I think if it's cool with you, we should discuss, before we get too far, or before we wrap up here, I'd like to discuss how we want to structure or our plans for structuring the following reviews,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
discussions, so people know what to expect from this series of discussions of ours. So what we've got is the next video that we'll be uploading will be a in-depth discussion of the first book, Name of the Wind. Obviously, you can then expect at some point in the future we'll have the second full book, A Wise Man's Fear, or The Wise Man's Fear. Like, what's it called? Wise Man's Fear.
Wise Man's Fear. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that we also have plans where there's a lot of characters. It's all filtered through basically one character's perspective, certainly in the past, and maybe a couple other ones sprinkled in the current or modern day, whatever current telling of the story, present day. At the Waystone Inn, there's a few other people that we hop into their perspective. But there's a wealth of characters, and the particularly juicy ones that have either controversy between ourselves or among the fan base, or who have particularly overwrought theories, based
which is most of them, to be fair. But we'll dive into some at least.
we can devote videos as on a sort of like an ad hoc basis, just to those characters, people like Bast, Devi, Ari, Denna, people like that. There will be more, I'm sure, but those are just a few of the ones that we need to discuss in depth. And also, he has all these sort of legends and mythical tales that are filtered in through the telling of the story and intermingle with history, and so there's all sorts of theories going on. So if we were to discuss everything in one video, it would be just way too much, as these books kind of attest. I mean, these are supposed to be told over the course of 3 days, and his audiobooks are like 30 and 40 hours long. Like, there's no way that the story can be told that way.
And touching on that, once we've covered these set videos that Matt's just highlighted, we'll also be going into kind of discussions and thoughts on book 3 and the varying degrees of potential that we feel that novel has. Largely a result of the length issue, because there are some questionable pacing choices in this series, given the fact that it's intended as a trilogy, at least at the current point in time. So that'll be something we'll discuss in a final kind of capstone video, I'm sure.
I think that right before we wrap up this discussion, we should sort of touch on that. We've already kind of talked about like what the book is, and talked a little bit about like what it's not. So we have that sort of tempered expectations going on, like for people who might see this who haven't read it. But if we talk about like sort of the aspects that we're not quite thrilled with, the pacing is definitely one that I think sometimes, I don't want to call it just a blanket bad thing, because it's definitely not. There's sometimes where the pacing is perfect, and then there's other times where pacing is not even really the thing. It's the things he chooses to devote his time to.
Exactly.
It's almost impossible for me to take like a hard line on this, where usually my opinions are pretty firm on this kind of thing, but with this author, because of how particular he is about everything, it feels very intentional and very precise, and at the same time I can't see where it's going, so it feels like a misspent time so much of the time. Is it? I don't know. I'm not saying it is, but it just feels that way sometimes to me. So when we say pacing, also keep in mind that that's sort of the baggage that I at least am bringing into it when I use that word. But just know that this is not a fast-paced story. This is not an endless action story.
Definitely not. It's a no point intended to be, and it's a no point sold. That even from like page 1, you can tell this is going to be a slower paced story, and it's definitely one of its strengths. No one here is going to be talking about how we want it to speed up. It's just it's not overall pacing, because it's actively choosing to step aside from the traditions of that framing in how it's kind of executing its flow, shall we say. But there are points where because, as you mentioned, there are points where it's perfectly paced on like a micro level. You know, this particular section or arc or scene even has been so well put together and just beautifully flows with the style. It's when it then jars into a point where you're thinking, okay, what's the purpose of this particular sequence dragging on, or what's the purpose of this particular sequence, this really interesting point, why are we rushing past this for the sake of this? You know, there are questions being raised on that level that may end up being completely answered, and it's all capstoned perfectly in the third book, and that's all very fine and well. But at the moment, given how, unlike most series where we kind of usually have at least a limited understanding of where it's going, because we don't have any understanding of that with the third book, because it's really is breaking new ground in terms of what it's going to be doing, given the amount of time it has left to do it, etc. We really don't know whether or not it's going to pay off. We're hoping very much so,
yes.
but we don't really see the way. We can't see what route it's going to take that's going to make some of the choices that have been made in terms of the timing and the time spent on different sequences in these first two books that could justify them. But we may be surprised.
Those reservations are one of the most unique thing about this experience for me, and I know for you as well, because we've discussed that. And I just wanted to right before we wrap this up, I just wanted to say that, but also I'll save specificity with this, like for like our in-depth review. I'm not thrilled with some of his decisions with how he wrote a lot of the women characters or female characters. It's not. But there's a lot that I want to say about that in specific detail, and I don't want to. I just want to say it real quick for those, because we're going to be ending this discussion soon. I'm not calling the author sexist, and I'm not saying that these are necessarily just like horribly offensive. There's just and some of it is definitely done with like a deliberate purpose because of the particular viewpoint he's funneling this through. But there are times where it gets a bit grating to read, or repetitious even, or just sort of
the usual sins that come to mind when someone describes that sort of situation with a book or a novel aren't applicable here, but there are problems where it kind of, the gradient of quality kind of dips a bit in this area compared to other parts of the story, and it's just something that we want to flag, and we'll go into specifics on that later with certain characters. It's never atrocious, it's just one of the weaknesses compared to the strengths of that we see everywhere
and
else.
Again, and it may even be intentional.
At certain points, it certainly is. Other times, it's questionable whether that's the case.
But yeah, I just wanted to mention that, and also I want to say, we don't have time to get into this because this is a whole discussion. But the main character himself is not at all free from controversy among the fan base. So that, just know that if you haven't read this, he is. If you don't like this character, it's not something like George R.R. Martin's work where there's this, like, all these different POV characters where you're constantly shifting perspectives. If you don't like this character, you're stuck with it. Like, it's his story. And for me, it took a long time, I got to admit, for me to like really be able to sort of like, toughen up my own hide and like, get over that, and just sort of I still wouldn't say that I'm in love with the character, but I find him interesting, and I'm now invested in the journey in a way that I wasn't quite convinced I would be the first time I tried this. But yeah,
and your mileage varies on that, because my experience is almost the opposite. I found well, not quite the opposite, but different enough. I engaged with the character pretty much immediately and found him very interesting, and I was right there with him. There are points where I certainly start to question things, like certain parts where, for lack of a better term, he is very much up his own arse. But there are varying degrees of acceptability for that, given what scene he's in and what is happening in any given moment. But yeah, it's a character that I personally enjoyed pretty much from the start, and it's so depending on your own perspective, depending on what you bring into the book, you may hate him on sight, you may love him on sight, you may just be kind of like, where's this going? It's definitely not one of those characters that's going to instantly put off everybody, which so many, which is critical.
That.
No, I know, but it's critical because of the way the story is told. Don't go into this thinking that if you don't like the character, there's not a chance for it to be saved, and don't think that it's going to be completely writing off the story anyway, because there are parts of this where it takes another step away from the main in terms of what's going on, enough for you to still enjoy the story. It's still being told through his words, but there are scenes where he's very much the side character at times.
Yeah, that's true. I wouldn't say that those are few. I would say that those are few and far between, though, because it is pretty much his thing. But yeah, I just wanted to make it clear, because the reason I'm saying that is because it did happen to me where I wanted to quit this book. And I probably wouldn't have finished it if it hadn't been for the way that you'd spoken about it.
I remember
and
the
a
exact
particular
moment
scene.
that saved it for
I
you
do
as well,
too.
which we're
I
looking
do
forward to
too.
discussing that
And
in the first
we'll
book.
get into that in the next, which I think is a good lead in for like when we're going to talk. Like we're going to go ahead and end this right now. But just know that this book, it's got like tremendous high points. There's a lot going on that we don't claim to understand at all. We both do have criticisms, and we are looking forward to discussing all of that: the good, the bad, the ugly, the I don't know, like in specific detail. So I hope that your appetite is whetted and that you're ready for more. And so we're gonna go ahead and sign off here and get into a discussion of The Name of the Wind proper.
See you
So
on the
this
other
is
side.
Matt, and I'm out of here. Thank you for joining. Thanks for joining us today.
Goodbye.